All right, peace and welcome back to Hidden Jewels. This is your sister Zahara, and the title of today's lesson is Love Your Enemies. You know, we've been mistaught by the Sunday churches and even still some of these Sabbath churches that to love your enemies means to love our enemies of the other nations. And that is not true. It is a lie. We must get into God's word to get the proper understanding. Precept must be upon precept so that you can find out what enemies are we to love. Okay? Now, I find it funny that these other nations who claim to be, many of them claim to be Christians, they do not practice this with their enemies. They go to war, they bomb, they terrorize, they lie. They do not seek the wealth or the peace of their enemies, and they do not pray for their enemies. They do not look for their enemies' forgiveness, okay? They only want harm and destruction to come on them, and we already know what they've done to us century after century after century, okay? So we have been deceived, okay? The other nations know that that's not what that means, okay? But they taught us that for a reason, so that we can stay subservient to them as our masters, okay? But anyway, I don't want to waste any time. Get out your Bible, pen, paper, take notes, and follow along. The first place we're going to go is Matthew chapter 5. Verses 43 through 44. You have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thy enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, and do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Now, I want to let you guys know that this is part 1 to love your enemies. On part 2, I'm going to explain verses 44 all the way down to 48. All right, but right now, I just want to define who this enemy is. First, let's go to Matthew chapter 4, verses 23 through 25, so we can find out who was Jesus even speaking to, okay? Because many people just jump to verses 43 and 44, but they don't even know what the audience was, who Jesus was talking to, nothing. They just start reading and just apply that verse to every nation, okay? And Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues. So we know that Jesus was dealing with Israel and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing all manner of sicknesses and all manner of disease among the people. And his fame went throughout all Syria, and they brought unto him all sick people that were taken with divers diseases and torments, and those which were possessed with devils, and those which were lunatic, and those that had the palsy, and he healed them. And there followed him great multitudes of people from Galilee, and from Decapolis, and from Jerusalem, and from Judea, and from beyond Jordan. So these are Israelites here, okay? Now let's go to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 1. And seeing the multitudes, Jesus, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, his disciples came unto him. So now we know that Jesus is dealing with Israel, and he's talking to his disciples who are Israelites, okay? Now, when you jump down to verse 43 and 48, 43 and 44, now you know who Jesus was telling this to, okay? Now, it said in verse 43, you have heard that it have been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. Let's go to Leviticus 19 and verse 17. It have been said, where? Right here in this Old Testament. Thou shalt not hate thy brother in thine heart. Thou shalt in any wise rebuke thy neighbor, and not suffer sin upon him. Thou shalt not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord. So if he says thou shalt not avenge nor bear a grudge against the children of your people, which means other fellow Israelites, then that means that we have some enmity there. Okay, you're going to have internal enemies within your nation, among your people. But the Most High is trying to teach us how to love one another. Let's go to Exodus chapter 23, verses 4 through 5. Exodus 23 and verse 4. If thou meet thine enemy's ox, okay, so this is a fellow Israelite, but they happen to be an enemy, or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it back to him again. If thou see the ass of him that hateth thee lying under his burden, and wouldest forbear to help him, thou shalt surely help with him. So imagine if this was taught properly in these churches, how this would just bless our communities, bless our nation. Black women, black men would get along, brothers and sisters, if we learn how to forgive one another, love one another, despite of what a fellow Israelite might have done to us. We should be quick to still help them, to still forgive them. All the love that we give to the enemies of these other nations, it should be given to the enemies amongst us. Okay? So just imagine all of that crime that we commit against one another, murdering each other, lying on one another, won't help each other because we may for some reason be at odds with one another. Micah chapter 2 and verses 7 through 8. O thou that art named the house of Jacob, is the spirit of the Lord straitened? Are these his doings? Do not my words do good to him that walketh uprightly? Even of late my people is risen up as an enemy. As an enemy. Ye pull off the robe with the garment from them that pass by securely, as men averse from war. And this is how we still treat each other to this day. So I see all that gang violence, and then, sisters be all clicked up and, they jump and want to beat down another sister or try to hurt another sister, or brothers hurting brothers, because no one is teaching us this. But then when it comes to our enemies, we are so quick to show them love and kindness, and they are known enemies. Okay, something is wrong with that mindset. It's not right. Micah chapter 7 and verse 6. For the son dishonoreth the father, the daughter riseth up against her mother, the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own house. And not just house as in a household, but even the house meaning a nation, a group of people. And this is us. This is our people. That's why there's so much internal conflict and strife. Okay. These are the enemies that Jesus is talking about. As a matter of fact, Jesus quoted Micah. Let's go to Matthew chapter 10, verses 35 through 36. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's foes or enemies shall be they of his own household. And Jesus would know something about that, because when he walked this earth, who was his enemies? The Pharisees, the scribes, they of the house of Judah. They hated Jesus. Those that were unbelievers. They even to the point where they put him to death, or they had him put to death. Okay? First Kings chapter 21 and verses 20. This is with King Ahab and the prophet Elijah. And Ahab said to Elijah, "Hast thou found me?" Watch this. Watch what he calls Elijah. "O mine enemy." A fellow Israelite is his enemy. And he answered, "I have found thee, because thou hast sold thyself to work evil in the sight of the Lord." But did you see what Ahab called the prophet Elijah, another Israelite? He called him his enemy. Now let's go to Galatians chapter 4 and verse 16. This is Paul. Watch what he says to the Israelites in Galatia. "Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth?" And so just like Paul, even those of us that are in this truth, we have become an enemy to our family, to our friends, to other Israelites. They despise us because we carry this truth. They hate us. Romans chapter 11 and verse 28. And this is Paul speaking to the Israelites in Rome about the Pharisees, the scribes, the unbelieving Jews of the house of Judah. Watch what he says about them. "As concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sakes. But as touching the election, they are beloved for the Father's sake." So yes, Israelites, other Israelites can be our enemies. And like I said, you will see in part 2 that who Jesus was specifically talking about in Matthew 5 verses 44 on down. You will see Philippians chapter 3, and we'll start at verse 17. And keep in mind, Paul is speaking to the Israelites in Philippi. Watch what he says. Brethren, just like in Leviticus 19. These are fellow Israelites. "Be followers together of me, and mark them which walk so, as ye have us for an example. For many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ." And who did the apostles and Jesus and them have a problem with? It was other fellow Israelites who were non-believers, who gave them much trouble and raised hell. Okay, just like Paul did before he came into the knowledge of Jesus Christ. Okay, Colossians chapter 1 and verse 21, and this is Paul speaking to the Israelites in Colossae. Okay, watch what he says about them. "And you that were sometime alienated," and watch this, "and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now have he reconciled." 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 13. "But ye, brethren," meaning Israelites, "be not weary in well doing. And if any man obey not our word by this epistle, note that man, and have no company with him, that he may be ashamed. Yet count him not as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother." Now let's go over to Romans chapter 12. Of course, we know that this is Paul speaking to the Israelites in Rome. Romans chapter 12 and verse 16. "Be of the same mind one toward another." So we know Paul is speaking to Israelites here, and he's saying have the same mind one toward another, but today we don't. We only have a mind for the other nations, okay? Instead of learning how to work amongst each other and love one another. Mind not high things, but condescend to men of low estate. Be not wise in your own conceits. Verse 17. Recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves. Now we apply all of this to the other nations, okay? No, this is about Israel. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Now, Paul, where did you get that avenge part from? Let's go back to Leviticus. This is how you know that he was dealing with Israel. Paul and them didn't just make stuff up. They were quoting the Torah and the prophets. There was no New Testament. They were the New Testament. Leviticus 19 and verse 18. Thou shalt not avenge. Thou shalt not avenge, nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people. That's why Paul says here, dearly beloved, avenge. Avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. And we will see an example of this with our forefather David and how he dealt with Saul. Verse 20. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Let's go look at an example. 1 Samuel 18, verse 29. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. And we know Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin and David was of the tribe of Judah. So yes, other Israelites can be our enemies, and the Most High has left instructions on how we ought to deal with a fellow Israelite who is an enemy. What I find funny is that in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 43, it's funny that same Jesus, we do know that this was him in the Old Testament. When it came to our actual enemies, he went to war with us and for us against our enemies. So now you're telling me when he comes in the flesh, it's something new now? No, we just don't have the understanding. Because the Lord, through the hand of Israel, in the old, we see all of those wars and how he was with our people against our actual enemies. But let's go to 1 Samuel 19 and verse 17. And Saul said unto Michal, why hast thou deceived me so, and sent away mine enemy, that he is escaped? And Michal answered Saul, he said unto me, let me go. Why should I kill thee? 1 Samuel 24, 16 through 19. And it came to pass, when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, that Saul said, is this thy voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And he said to David, thou art more righteous than I, for thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I have rewarded thee evil. You see that? And we read that in Romans. Because why? Paul was teaching them the same thing. This is something that David did. And we should all learn as a people. My God, if this was taught in the churches correctly, if this was taught to our people correctly, oh my goodness, I'm sure that the crime amongst one another, the evils that we do to each other would decrease. See, in Romans 12, recompense to no man evil for evil. What did Saul say to David? For thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I have rewarded the evil. 18, and thou hast showed this day how that thou hast dealt well with me. For as much as when the Lord had delivered me into thine hand, thou killedest me not. Okay, but today our people just kill each other because they don't have the mindset that our father David had. And this is what we need back. We have it when it comes to the enemies of the other nations, but not the enemies internally. For if, verse 19, for if a man find his enemy, will he let him go well away? Wherefore the Lord reward thee good for that thou hast done unto me this day. So, and then of course we know the end of the story. The Most High took care of that whole thing. The Lord, David left Saul into the Lord's hand. He didn't do it himself, okay? He loved his brothers. He loved his sisters despite if they were enemies or not. But notice that whenever David dealt with his real enemies, he slew Goliath, slew the Philistines. He went to war with his enemies, to war with Ziklag, took down all his enemies. But he didn't do his fellow Israelites like that who were his enemies. We can learn from this, okay? You have to remember Jesus is teaching our people how to love each other, whether we're enemies or not. Because we're blood, we're kin, we're of the same people. We're God's chosen people. And I know that we can do it. We just have been brainwashed to give all of our love, to give all of the forgiveness to our enemies of the other nations. And that's unfortunate. Now let's go to 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8. Finally, and we know Peter is talking to Israelites. Finally, be ye all of one mind, having compassion one of another. Love as brethren. Be pitiful, be courteous, not rendering evil for evil. And when you do evil, that means you're getting back at somebody for something they did to you, another Israelite. Again, that's why I said that we see that gun violence, murdering each other. We see sisters jumping and they killing each other. We're so quick to get back at one another. We're so quick to do evil to one another who we consider an enemy. But then when it comes to the other nations, we're so docile and humble and just forgive, and you just have to love. Jesus said, love your enemies. Something is wrong with that. Verse 9, not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing. That railing is got another fellow Israelite slandering you, cussing you out, gossiping, saying hateful, insolent things to you and about you. And so you say, well, I'm gonna do it to them too. But contrariwise, blessing, knowing that ye are thereunto called, that you should inherit a blessing. So we have to understand that these enemies that Jesus is talking about here in Matthew 5, and you will definitely see in part 2, that these enemies are fellow Israelites, fellow Israelites. These are our enemies, but we have to learn how to love one another, even though we may be at odds, because we're not always going to see eye to eye. It's always going to be something with somebody within Israel. Okay, but anyway, this was just part one to this lesson, love your enemies. I really wanted to go deep on here, but like I said, I had to keep it short. But on part two, I'm going to show you what enemies specifically that Jesus was speaking about. We've been asleep for too long, listening to lies, still sipping the Kool-Aid. I hope you all have got some understanding for this first part. And with that, I will say shalom.